"Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Those were the words my daughter said to me while standing in the driveway of the house I'd lived in for nearly 30 years. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just stood there with her arms crossed while her husband loaded the last of my boxes into the back of my old pickup truck. "Emily," I said, staring at her, "your mother hasn't even been gone a year." She looked away. "That's exactly why you need to move on." I remember glancing toward the front window and seeing my son Michael inside the house, measuring the living room wall with a tape measure. The house wasn't even theirs yet. Nothing had been signed, nothing had been decided. But somehow they were already acting like I was the guest. "Dad," Michael called through the screen door, "we're just trying to help you." Help me. That's what they called it. Selling family furniture without asking. Rearranging rooms that still smelled like my late wife Susan's lavender candles. Talking about retirement communities while I was sitting right there in the room. The worst part wasn't what they did, it was how easily they did it. As if I had already disappeared. As if I was some old photograph hanging on a wall nobody looked at anymore. I drove away that afternoon with everything I still owned, fitting inside a truck bed and a trailer barely 8 feet long. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept thinking the same thing. How did my own family become strangers? Before I tell you what happened next, I'd like to ask something small. If this story speaks to your heart, or if it truly resonates with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, leave a comment telling me your city or country and what your local time is. I always enjoy seeing where people are watching from. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of the phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and even my own name. And the real lesson I learned from all of this. Well, stay with me until the end. Now let me take you back to where it all began. 3 months after that day, I was living alone in a small rental cottage outside Norfolk, Virginia. It sat less than half a mile from the water. The place wasn't much. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a porch that creaked every time I stepped on it. But it was quiet, quiet enough that sometimes the loneliness felt louder than any noise. Most mornings I drank coffee on the porch and watched fishing boats drift across the bay. Some days I didn't speak to another human being until sunset. My children called occasionally, usually when they needed something. Never for long. Then one rainy Tuesday night, a little after 2 in the morning, my phone rang. I almost ignored it. Nobody calls at that hour unless something is wrong. I grabbed my glasses from the nightstand and looked at the screen. Unknown number. I answered anyway. "Hello?" For a moment, all I heard was static. Then a man's voice. Calm. Professional. "Mr. Nathan Cole?" "Yes. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm calling on behalf of Admiral Richard Whitmore." I sat up immediately. The name sounded familiar. Everybody in Virginia knew the name. Richard Whitmore wasn't just a retired Fleet Admiral. He was a legend, a decorated naval officer, a billionaire, the kind of man whose name was printed on buildings and scholarship funds. "I think you have the wrong number," I said. "No, sir, we do not." There was a pause. "Admiral Whitmore specifically requested you." I laughed quietly. "That's impossible." "Why?" "Because I've never met him." Another pause. Longer this time. Then the man said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Mr. Cole, according to Admiral Whitmore, that's exactly why he wants to see you." I stared into the darkness of my bedroom. "I don't understand." "Neither did I," the man replied, until he showed me a photograph. "A photograph of what?" Silence. Then, very carefully, he answered, "A photograph of your mother." And in that moment, sitting alone in a dark room at 2 o'clock in the morning, I realized somebody had been keeping a secret for a very, very long time. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat at the small kitchen table staring at a photograph that had not existed in my life an hour earlier. Daniel Mercer had emailed it to me before dawn. The image was old, faded around the edges. My mother looked no older than 25. She was standing beside a young man in a Navy uniform. They were smiling at something outside the frame. I must have looked at that picture 100 times before the sun came up. The strange thing was not my mother. It was the feeling that I had seen that man's face somewhere before. Growing up, questions about my father were never welcome in our house. My mother, Helen Cole, raised me alone in a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina. Whenever I asked about my father, The conversation ended quickly. "He is gone, Nathan," she would say while folding laundry or washing dishes. "That is all you need to know." As a boy, I accepted it. As a teenager, I hated it. By the time I became an adult, I convinced myself it no longer mattered. But looking back now, I realized there were always small things that never made sense. My grandfather adored my cousins. He took them fishing. He bought them birthday presents. He taught them how to drive tractors on his property. Me? I was treated differently. Not cruelly, just differently enough to notice. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was about 12. My cousins each received a pocket watch that had supposedly belonged to our family for generations. I got a $20 bill in an envelope. "Why did they get watches?" I asked. My grandfather barely looked up from his coffee. "Those belong to the family line." I remember staring at him. "Aren't I family?" The room became quiet. My mother immediately changed the subject. On the drive home, I asked her again, "Mom, what did Grandpa mean?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Nothing." It did not sound like nothing. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Some questions only bring pain, Nathan." That answer stayed with me for years. There were other moments, small ones, easy to dismiss if you looked at them alone. Once, when I was 16, I found an old lockbox in the attic. Inside were photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings. Before I could read any of them, my mother rushed upstairs. I had never seen her move so fast. "Give me that," she said. "Why?" "Because it is private." "Whose?" For a second, she looked scared. Not angry, scared. Then she took the box and carried it downstairs. I never saw it again. Years later, after she passed away, I searched every closet, every cabinet, every drawer in her house. The lockbox was gone. Completely gone. Sitting in my cottage all those years later, staring at the photograph Daniel had sent, those memories came flooding back. Little pieces that had never fit together suddenly felt important. Around noon, my phone rang again. It was Daniel. "Have you decided?" he asked. "About what?" "Whether you will come meet Admiral Whitmore." I looked at the photograph lying on the table. Why does he have a picture of my mother? There was a long pause. "Mr. Cole," Daniel finally said, "that is a question only the Admiral can answer." I stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the bay was calm. Gray clouds drifted across the water. "How old is he?" I asked. 89. And he specifically asked for me? By name. My stomach tightened. I have never met this man. "That may be true," Daniel said quietly. "But I do not think he believes that." An hour later, I packed an overnight bag. As I zipped it closed, my eyes landed on the photograph one last time. That was when I noticed something I had completely missed. Written in tiny faded handwriting on the back was a date from more than 70 years ago, and a single sentence that made my heart stop. It read, "For Richard. One day he deserves to know the truth." The drive to Annapolis took a little over 4 hours, and the entire time I kept replaying that sentence in my head. For Richard. One day he deserves to know the truth. I must have read it 50 times at red lights and gas stations. By the time I reached the Whitmore estate, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees. The property was larger than anything I had ever seen up close. A long private road wound through acres of manicured lawns before opening onto a massive waterfront mansion overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. I almost turned around. That would have been the old version of me. The man who spent his whole life avoiding uncomfortable questions. The man who accepted being left out. The man who told himself that some doors were not meant for people like him. But this time I did something different. I parked the truck and walked to the front door. A woman in her 50s greeted me. "Mr. Cole?" she asked. "Yes. I am Margaret. I manage the household. The Admiral has been expecting you." Something about those words felt strange. Expecting you. As if this meeting had been planned long before I ever received that phone call. Margaret led me through hallways lined with naval portraits, medals, and framed photographs from every decade of Richard Whitmore's life. Then she stopped outside a large study. "He is inside." I took a breath and stepped through the doorway. An elderly man sat beside a window overlooking the water. His shoulders seemed smaller than the photographs I had seen. His hair was completely white, but his eyes were sharp, very sharp. He looked at me for several seconds without saying a word. Then he smiled softly. "Nathan." Hearing my first name from a stranger felt oddly personal. "Admiral Whitmore." He shook his head. Please, Richard. I sat across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the same question that had followed me since childhood. Tell me about your father. Most people would have answered immediately. I could not. I never knew him, I said. Richard looked down at his hands. There was sadness there. Real sadness. And your mother? She passed away 8 years ago. He nodded slowly. Helen was a remarkable woman. My heart nearly stopped. I leaned forward. You knew her? Richard looked toward the bay. A very long time ago. Before I could ask another question, the study door opened. 3 people walked in without knocking. A man in an expensive suit, a woman wearing enough jewelry to light up a room, and a younger man carrying a phone in front of his face. None of them looked happy to see me. Uncle Richard, the older man said. Who is this? Richard's expression immediately changed. The warmth disappeared. This is Nathan. Nathan who? The woman asked. A guest, Richard replied. The younger man laughed. Another guest? Seriously? Richard did not answer. The tension in the room became impossible to miss. The man in the suit extended his hand. Derek Whitmore. His smile never reached his eyes. Family. I shook his hand. Nathan Cole. Derek studied me for a second longer than normal. Interesting. Richard suddenly stood up. That will be enough. The room went silent. A few minutes later, they left, but not before I caught Derek looking back at me from the doorway. The look was not curiosity, it was concern, as if my presence created a problem he did not understand yet. Later that evening, Margaret showed me to a guest room. As she reached the door, she hesitated. Mr. Cole? Yes? She lowered her voice. The Admiral has not invited anyone to stay here in over 15 years. I stared at her. Why me? Margaret looked toward the hallway to make sure nobody was listening. Then she quietly said, that is exactly what the family has been asking all week. The next morning, I woke up earlier than everyone else and walked down to the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the sound of coffee brewing somewhere in the distance. For a few minutes, it almost felt peaceful. Then I heard voices coming from the dining room. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I simply froze when I heard my name. He is still here? A woman's voice asked. It was Linda Whitmore. Apparently, Derek answered. Uncle Richard barely knows what day it is anymore. Then why is he spending time with that man? Another voice said. Because somebody put an idea in his head, Derek replied. And we need to find out who. I should have walked away. Instead, I stayed where I was. Do you think he is after money? Linda asked. Derek laughed. Everybody is after money. The strange thing was not the accusation. The strange thing was how confident they sounded, as if they had already decided who I was before speaking to me for more than 30 seconds. Later that morning, Richard invited me to join him on the back terrace overlooking the bay. The wind was cool, and several sailboats drifted across the water. For almost an hour, we talked about ordinary things: teaching, history, fishing, the small town where I grew up. More than once, I noticed Richard studying my face when he thought I was not looking. Finally, he asked another question. Did your mother ever talk about Annapolis? No. Did she ever mention the Navy? Never. He nodded slowly and looked disappointed. Before I could ask why, Derek appeared carrying a folder. Sorry to interrupt, he said. Business. Richard's expression immediately hardened. Later. It is important. Later. Derek forced a smile and left. But as he walked away, he looked directly at me. That look stayed with me all day. By dinner, something had changed. The atmosphere in the house felt colder. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. Staff members who had been friendly that morning suddenly seemed nervous. Even Margaret appeared uncomfortable. Finally, I asked her what was going on. She hesitated. I probably should not say. Please. She lowered her voice. Some members of the family believe you contacted the Admiral for personal reasons. I stared at her. I did not even know he existed until 2 days ago. I know that. Then why would anyone believe otherwise? Margaret gave a sad smile. Because people tend to believe the version of events that benefits them. That evening things became worse. As I entered the library, I found Derek, Linda, and 2 other relatives sitting together. The conversation stopped immediately. Derek stood up. Nathan, maybe you can clear something up. What is that? How exactly did you convince Uncle Richard to bring you here? I felt my stomach drop. There it was. The story had already spread. I did not convince him of anything. Interesting, Linda said, because that is not what everyone is hearing. I looked from face to face. Every one of them seemed ready to believe the worst. Years ago, I would have apologized. I would have tried to keep the peace. Instead, I remained calm. Believe whatever you want, I said. The truth does not change. Nobody responded. The silence was worse than an argument. When I finally left the room, I noticed Margaret standing in the hallway. She looked pale. Nathan, she whispered. You need to come quickly. Why? Her eyes filled with worry. Something has happened to Richard. When I reached Richard's room, 2 medical professionals were already there. Margaret stood near the doorway, twisting her hands together. Richard was awake, but he looked exhausted. The strength I had seen in him the day before seemed to have faded overnight. He noticed me immediately. Nathan, he said quietly. Come in. I stepped closer. Are you all right? He managed a small smile. I have been better. One of the doctors explained that Richard needed rest and would be limiting visitors. The word visitors caught my attention because, within an hour, the entire household seemed to adopt it. Not guest. Not friend. Visitor. It was a small change, but it spread fast. At breakfast, nobody sat near me. At lunch, conversation stopped when I entered the room. By dinner, I felt like I was attending a gathering where everyone had been given instructions except me. The strange part was how organized it felt. Nobody openly accused me of anything. Nobody raised their voice. Yet somehow a story had formed around me, and everyone seemed to accept it as fact. The next morning I received an email from a family office administrator informing me that all future visits with Richard would need approval. I stared at the screen. Approval? I was staying in the house because Richard had invited me. I replied immediately. There was no response. A few hours later, I sent another message asking whether Richard had personally requested the change. Again, nothing. That evening I called Daniel Mercer. Daniel, what is happening? There was a pause. Things are complicated right now. Did Richard ask for these restrictions? Another pause. I cannot discuss internal family matters. That was not my question. His voice softened. Nathan, just give it a little time. Time. Everybody suddenly wanted more time. I tried writing Richard a short note, nothing dramatic. Just a few lines asking how he was feeling and wishing him well. I handed it to a staff member. The next day, the envelope appeared outside my guest room door unopened. No explanation, no message. Just returned. For the first time since arriving, I felt something close to panic. Not because of money, not because of the family, because I could feel answers slipping away. The answers I had spent 72 years unknowingly searching for. A day later, I received a text message from my daughter Emily. We had barely spoken in weeks. Saw an article online. Are you staying at Whitmore's estate? I stared at the message. Somehow the rumors had already escaped the house. I called her immediately. Emily, where did you hear that? Michael showed me. And where did Michael hear it? Silence. Then she said, Dad, people are saying you are trying to get close to an old billionaire. The words hit harder than I expected. Do you believe that? Another silence. Longer this time. I do not know what to believe. After we hung up, I sat alone on a bench overlooking the water. For several minutes, I just watched the waves move across the bay. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was my son. His message was only one sentence long. Please do not embarrass yourself chasing something that is not yours. I read it 3 times. Then I locked the screen. That night I sent one final email. One final note. One final request to speak directly with Richard. No response came, not from him. Not from anyone. As darkness settled over the estate, every hallway felt quieter than before. Every door felt heavier. And for the first time since arriving, I began to wonder whether I had come all this way only to lose the truth forever. The next 2 days felt strangely empty. The estate was still full of people, but I had never felt more alone. Richard remained in his room under medical supervision, and nobody would tell me much beyond that. Every request I made was politely redirected. Every question seemed to disappear into a wall of careful answers. One afternoon, I stood outside the study where I had first met him. The door was closed. The lights were off. For some reason, seeing that room dark hit me harder than I expected. It reminded me of something I had spent most of my life avoiding. Loss does not always arrive in a single moment. Sometimes it arrives one closed door at a time. That evening I sat by the water until long after sunset. The bay was almost completely still. I remember hearing footsteps behind me. It was Margaret. She handed me a cup of coffee and sat beside me without speaking for a while. Finally, she said, "You care about him." I stared at the dark water. "I barely know him." "That is not what I asked." I smiled sadly. "Then yes, I do." Margaret nodded. "He talks differently when you are around." "How?" She looked down at her cup. "Hopeful." Neither of us said anything after that. The word stayed with me. Hopeful. The next morning I learned that Richard had refused to meet with several relatives. Yet somehow I was still not allowed to see him either. That was when something shifted inside me. Up until then, I had been waiting for someone else to give me answers. Waiting for permission. Waiting for the truth to arrive neatly packaged. But sitting alone in that guest room, I realized something. Nobody was coming to explain my life to me. If there was a secret, people had spent decades protecting it. Why would they suddenly start being honest now? Later that day, I called my daughter Emily again. This time the conversation was different. "Dad," she said quietly, "you sound tired." "I am." There was a pause. I should not have said what I said before. I looked out the window. Which part? The part where I assumed the worst. Hearing that surprised me. Emily was not someone who apologized easily. "Thank you," I said. "What are you going to do?" she asked. For the first time in days, I had an answer. "I am going to stop waiting." After we hung up, I began looking more carefully at everything around me. Photographs, bookshelves, naval memorabilia, family portraits. Patterns started appearing. Certain years were missing. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Certain photographs had clearly been removed from albums long ago. Small things. Easy to overlook. But once I noticed them, I could not stop noticing them. That night, Margaret knocked on my door. Her expression was serious. "Nathan, there is something you should see." She led me through a quiet hallway to a storage room near the back of the house. Inside were dozens of boxes filled with records and personal items. "These were supposed to be archived years ago," she said. "Nobody has looked through them in decades." "Why are you showing me this?" Margaret hesitated. "Because sometimes families spend so much energy protecting a story that they forget where they hid the evidence." My heart started beating faster. She pointed toward a dusty box on the far shelf. Written across the side in fading black marker were 3 words. "Private Correspondence 1953. And somehow, before I even touched it, I knew my mother's name was waiting somewhere inside. My hands were shaking when I lifted the lid of the box. Not because I expected money or some dramatic revelation. At that point, I simply wanted the truth. Margaret stood quietly beside me while I sorted through yellowed envelopes, Christmas cards, and decades of correspondence. Most of it had nothing to do with me. Naval contacts, family updates. Format invitation. Then I found a bundle tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Every envelope carried the same handwriting. My mother's. For a moment, I could not breathe. I carefully opened the first letter. The date was June 1953. The words inside were simple, personal, familiar. She wrote about her job, the weather, a broken porch step. Things ordinary people write when they care about someone. I opened another, then another. Hours passed. The story slowly began to take shape. My mother and Richard had known each other when they were young, very young, long before his military career made him famous, long before his name appeared in newspapers. What surprised me most was not the relationship itself. It was the affection, the warmth, the trust. The man described in those letters sounded nothing like the distant public figure whose portrait hung throughout the estate. He sounded human. By evening, I had organized dozens of letters across a large table. Margaret studied them quietly. "You found something important, didn't you?" she asked. "I think so. What do you think it means?" I looked at a photograph clipped inside one of the envelopes. My mother was smiling beside a group of young people near a marina. Richard stood only a few feet away. "I do not know yet," I admitted. "But somebody worked very hard to keep these hidden." The next morning, I stopped waiting for answers from other people and started creating my own path forward. I made copies of every letter. I built a timeline. I filled pages of a notebook with dates, names, locations, and connections. It felt strangely familiar. After all, I had spent most of my life teaching history. Now I was researching my own. Days passed. I rarely saw the Whitmore relatives. That was fine with me. For the first time since arriving, I had purpose. Every morning I worked through the archive boxes. Every afternoon I reviewed notes. Every evening I compared facts. The more I learned, the more confident I became that the story I had been told about my family was incomplete. One afternoon, Daniel Mercer found me in the library surrounded by documents. He looked at the stacks of papers and smiled. "You have been busy." I finally stopped waiting for permission. He nodded approvingly. "That is probably wise." "Did you know about these letters?" I asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. "I knew they existed." "And nobody thought to tell me?" "Nathan, some truths are not hidden because they are unimportant. Sometimes they are hidden because too many people are afraid of what happens when they come out." That answer stayed with me. A few days later, I received another call from Emily. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in months. "Dad, you sound different." "Different how?" "Stronger." I laughed softly. Maybe I finally remembered who I was. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about rumors. Not about family disputes. Just life. It felt good. Real. When the call ended, I returned to the archive room and opened another box. Inside was a leather-bound ledger. Tucked between two pages was a folded document marked with a date from decades earlier. At the bottom was a signature I immediately recognized. Richard Whitmore. And beneath that signature was a name I had never seen before, a name connected directly to my mother, a name that suggested everything I believed about my family was about to change. I unfolded the document carefully and carried it to a desk near the window where the afternoon light was stronger. The paper was old, but the handwriting was clear. It was not a letter. It was a legal record. Names, dates, witness signatures, notes written in the margins. The more I read, the more I realized I was looking at something that had never been meant for public eyes. Margaret stood across from me. "What is it?" she asked. I looked up slowly. "I think this is part of the reason somebody spent decades hiding those boxes." That night I barely slept. Not because I was confused anymore, but because for the first time, pieces of my life were starting to fit together. The uncertainty that had followed me since childhood was slowly being replaced by something else. Clarity. The next morning, I stopped acting like a guest. I started acting like a historian. Every box was cataloged. Every document was photographed. Every date was entered into a notebook. By the end of the week, I had converted one corner of the archive room into a small research workspace. Stacks of folders sat in neat rows. Timelines covered an entire wall. Margaret laughed the first time she saw it. "This looks more organized than the family office." 30 years in education," I replied. "Old habits. You seem different." "I am." And it was true. For weeks I had been reacting to events. Now I was directing my own search. The change was subtle, but I could feel it. One afternoon, Daniel Mercer entered the room carrying a small cardboard box. He stopped and looked around. "Good Lord. What?" I asked. "You built an investigation center." I smiled. "I built a classroom." He laughed and placed the box on the table. Inside were additional records from an off-site storage facility. "The Admiral authorized access months ago," Daniel said. "Nobody ever bothered reviewing them." I opened the first folder and immediately found more references connected to my mother's hometown. Daniel noticed my expression. "Something useful?" "Very." He nodded. "I had a feeling. During those days, people inside the estate started treating me differently. Not because of money, not because of family politics. Because I was producing answers. Staff members began bringing me old photographs they had discovered in drawers. Former employees shared stories about events that had happened decades earlier. A retired groundskeeper even drove over one afternoon carrying a photo album he had kept since the 1960s. "Thought you might need these," he said. Looking through those pages felt like opening windows into forgotten years. The most surprising change happened inside me. For most of my life, I had introduced myself as a retired teacher, a widower, a father, a grandfather. Those things were still true. But now I felt connected to something larger than the questions that had followed me since childhood. Every morning I pinned a small visitor badge to my shirt before entering the archive room. It was nothing special, white plastic, black lettering, Nathan Cole. Research Access. Yet somehow that badge became symbolic. It represented purpose, direction, progress. One evening, Margaret looked at it and smiled. You wear that thing like a military medal. Maybe because I earned it." She laughed. Fair enough. As the days passed, the timeline became clearer. The hidden connections became harder to ignore. More importantly, I no longer felt like a man searching for acceptance. I felt like a man uncovering facts. Facts did not care about rumors. Facts did not care about family politics. Facts simply waited to be found. Then, late one evening, Daniel received a phone call. I watched his expression change as he listened. When he ended the call, the room fell quiet. "Nathan," he said carefully, "you should probably come with me." "Why?" Daniel looked toward the hallway leading to the private wing of the estate. "Because Richard is asking for you personally. And according to his doctors, this conversation cannot wait much longer." The walk to Richard's room felt longer than it had any right to. The hallway was quiet except for the soft sound of our footsteps. Daniel said very little. That alone told me how serious things had become. When we reached the door, he stopped. "He asked specifically for you," he said. "Nobody else." I nodded. "How is he?" Daniel took a slow breath, tired, but very clear. Then he opened the door. Richard was sitting upright near the window. The evening sun painted the room in shades of gold and orange. For the first time since arriving at the estate, I saw no medical staff, no relatives, no interruptions. Just the two of us. He motioned toward the chair beside him. "Sit down, Nathan." His voice was weaker than before, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. I sat. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. We simply looked out across the bay. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Have you found the letters?" I looked at him. "You knew about them." A faint smile crossed his face. "Of course I did." "Then why not tell me?" He stared toward the water. "Because some truths are more powerful when discovered than when delivered." I thought about that. Then I reached into my folder and placed several copies of the letters on the table between us. Richard looked down at them. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the top page. She kept writing long after I stopped hearing from her. "My mother never talked about you." Pain flickered across his face. That was not her choice. The room became very still. For the first time, I felt something important shifting, not just emotionally, practically. For weeks, everyone around me had controlled information. They controlled access. They controlled conversations. They controlled what I was allowed to see. Now the only person who actually knew the story was sitting directly across from me. The balance had changed. Richard suddenly looked toward the door. "Is it locked?" I turned. "Yes." He nodded with visible relief. "Good." That single word told me everything. There were things he did not want overheard, things he had protected for decades. He pointed toward the folder in my lap. "You have done more in a few weeks than some people have managed in 40 years. I almost laughed. I was a history teacher. "No." He shook his head. "You were persistent." We sat quietly for another minute. Then there was a knock. Before either of us could respond, the door opened. Derek stepped inside. His expression immediately changed when he saw me sitting beside Richard. "Uncle Richard, the family office needs your signature on several documents." Richard did not even look at him. Later, Derek remained standing there. "It is important." Richard finally turned toward him. I said later. The room went silent. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Derek was the uncomfortable one. He glanced at me, then back at Richard. "Fine." He left without another word. The door closed. Richard waited several seconds before speaking again. "Do you know why they are nervous?" "I have a few theories." "Because they know there are things they cannot explain." His gaze settled on the folder. "And because they know the answers are getting closer." The sun had almost disappeared below the horizon now. Shadows stretched across the room. Richard reached toward the bedside table and opened a drawer. From inside, he removed a small sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in handwriting that looked decades old. I stared at it. "What is that?" Richard held the envelope carefully between his fingers. His eyes looked older than I had ever seen them. "Nathan," he said quietly, "everything changed the day your mother made one decision." My heart started pounding. Richard extended the envelope toward me. "And before I leave this world, you deserve to know exactly why." My fingers lingered on the envelope for several seconds before I opened it. Richard watched quietly from his chair. Inside was a single folded document and a photograph. The photograph showed 3 people standing beside a sailboat. Richard was there. My mother was there. And between them stood a young man I had never seen before. I unfolded the document. It was a sworn statement signed decades ago. Halfway down the page, I saw the unfamiliar name again. This time there was no ambiguity, no missing pieces, no room for interpretation. I looked up at Richard. This changes everything. He nodded slowly. I know. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than any conversation. Finally, Richard leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. There are people in this house who spent years protecting their version of the story, he said. Not because it was true, because it was useful. I looked down at the document again. Does Daniel know? Only part of it. Margaret? Very little. He opened his eyes. Most of the truth died one person at a time, until only a few fragments remained. Before I could respond, the door opened. Daniel stepped inside. His expression immediately told me something was happening. Richard, he said carefully, the family is asking for an update. Richard gave a tired smile. Of course they are. Daniel glanced toward me. Then he noticed the open envelope. For the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely surprised. You showed him? Richard nodded. It is time. The next morning, a formal meeting was arranged in the main conference room overlooking the water. Everyone seemed to know something important was coming, even if they did not know what. When I entered the room, conversation stopped. Derek sat near the center of the table. Linda was beside him. Several attorneys were present. Financial advisors. Longtime family associates. Nobody looked comfortable. Daniel stood near the front with a folder in his hands. Richard arrived a few minutes later. The room immediately became silent. He moved slower than before, but the authority was still there. Decades of command had not disappeared. Once everyone was seated, Richard looked around the room. Before we continue with future planning, he said calmly, there are matters that require clarification. Derek shifted slightly in his chair. What kind of clarification? Richard looked directly at him. The kind that should have happened many years ago. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Daniel placed several documents on the table. Copies, records, correspondence, legal filings, evidence, one by one. The room remained quiet as people began reading. Linda's face changed first, then Derek's, then the attorneys. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The documents were too precise for that. Finally, Derek looked up. These records were never included in the family archive. I know, Richard replied. That was intentional. Another long silence followed. I could feel the balance of power shifting across the room. For weeks, people had treated me as an outsider standing at the edge of a story. Now they were discovering that I had been standing much closer to the center than any of them realized. Linda slowly set her papers down. Who else knows about this? Richard turned toward me. He does. Every eye in the room followed his gaze. Not with hostility this time. Not with suspicion. Something else. Recognition. Uncertainty. Realization. Derek stared at me for several seconds. Then he looked back at Richard. You are telling me he is connected to all of this? Richard answered without hesitation. Yes. The room became completely still. Then Daniel opened the final folder, removed a single certified record, and placed it in front of the family. As their eyes moved across the page, I watched the color drain from more than one face. Because at that exact moment, they finally understood who I really was. The certified record passed slowly from one person to another. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. The silence itself felt like evidence. After weeks of assumptions, rumors, and carefully protected stories, everyone was staring at documents that had come from court archives, historical records, sworn statements, private correspondence, and authenticated family files. None of it had appeared by accident. Every page had a source. Every signature could be verified. Every date matched. Finally, Linda lowered the document and looked toward Richard. You knew all this time? Richard answered calmly. Not all this time, but long enough. Derek leaned forward. Then, why was none of this disclosed? Daniel responded before Richard could speak. Because portions of these records were intentionally separated from the primary family archive decades ago. One of the attorneys nodded. The documentation trail is clear. We already verified the chain of custody. Nobody argued with that. They could not. The proof was sitting directly in front of them. I remained quiet. For most of my life, I had imagined what it would feel like to learn where I truly came from. I expected anger, relief, vindication. Instead, what I felt was something simpler. Peace. Not complete peace, but enough to finally stop carrying questions that had followed me since childhood. Linda looked at me carefully. Did you know any of this before coming here? No. Not even a suspicion? None. She stared for a moment before slowly nodding. For the first time, I think she believed me. Across the table, Derek seemed less interested in the history than in the consequences. So what happens now? He asked. Richard turned toward him. The truth happens now. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The facts had already spoken louder than any argument. After the meeting ended, several people approached me individually. Some offered polite words. Some asked questions. Others simply seemed unsure how to behave. The change was impossible to miss. A few weeks earlier, they had viewed me as an unexpected outsider. Now they were trying to understand where I fit into a story they thought they already knew. Later that afternoon, Derek found me alone near the marina. The water was calm, and a light breeze moved across the docks. He stood beside me for several seconds before speaking. I owe you an apology. I looked out at the bay. For what? He gave a tired laugh. You know exactly for what. Maybe. He nodded. I thought I understood what was happening. I was wrong. That was probably the most honest thing I had heard from him since arriving. I appreciated it, but honesty and trust are not the same thing. Derek, I said, I am not here to settle scores. Then what do you want? It was a fair question. I thought about it for a moment. I want the truth to remain the truth. Nothing more. He looked surprised by the answer. Maybe he expected demands, conditions, negotiations. Instead, I simply stood there watching the water. Because for the first time in a very long time, I did not need anything from anyone. That evening, Emily called. Daniel must have informed her that important developments had occurred. Dad, she said softly, how are you holding up? I smiled. Better than I expected. You sound different again. Maybe I finally stopped trying to earn a place in other people's stories. There was a long pause. I am proud of you. Those 4 words meant more than she probably realized. Yet even as the conversations grew calmer and the tension inside the estate began to fade, something remained unresolved. Because later that night, Daniel arrived at my door carrying another sealed folder. He held it carefully and said only one sentence. Nathan, there is still one document Richard has not shown anyone. The final document turned out to be Richard's personal declaration, signed, witnessed, notarized, and updated over the years whenever new evidence surfaced. It was not a legal argument. It was a confession, a record of mistakes, choices, promises, and consequences. More importantly, it explained why so much had been hidden. The truth was not about money. It never had been. It was about fear, pride, family pressure, and a decision made decades earlier that changed the course of several lives. Richard spent nearly 2 hours answering questions from attorneys, advisors, and family members. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody challenged the documents anymore. There was simply too much evidence. By the end of that meeting, the remaining uncertainty was gone. The family understood exactly how I was connected to the story, how the records had been verified, and why Richard had spent his final years trying to make sure the truth would survive him. A few weeks later, Richard passed away peacefully. The estate grounds were quiet that morning. The flags moved gently in the wind coming off the bay. There was no dramatic scene, no last-minute revelation, just a profound silence that seemed to settle over everything. I attended the memorial service, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing outside looking in. I was simply there, exactly where I belonged. When the will was formally executed, the terms reflected the intentions Richard had documented for years. Some assets supported charitable programs, veterans organizations, educational initiatives, and long-standing commitments he cared deeply about. Other portions followed the legal framework that had been carefully established through the verified records. The outcome surprised many people, but by then the facts had already done their work. What mattered most was not what I received. What mattered was what I recovered. I recovered my history. I recovered answers. I recovered a piece of myself that had been missing for more than 70 years. In the months that followed, my life changed in practical ways, but not in the ways people might assume. I moved into a comfortable home overlooking the water, not far from where this journey had begun. Emily visited often. Michael and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. Not perfectly, not overnight, but honestly. We had difficult conversations. We admitted mistakes. We learned that healing usually begins when someone decides to stop defending the past and start telling the truth about it. One afternoon, nearly a year later, Margaret visited for coffee. As we sat on the porch watching sailboats cross the bay, she smiled and said, "You seem at peace." I thought about that for a moment. I think I finally stopped asking other people to tell me who I am. She nodded. That sounds like peace to me. Looking back now, the biggest lesson was not about inheritance, family secrets, or even betrayal. It was about identity. If you allow other people to define your worth, they will often define it according to their convenience, not your value. Protect your finances. Protect your emotional well-being. Pay attention to your instincts. Ask questions when something does not make sense. And never surrender your self-respect just to keep other people comfortable. I also learned that healing is not something another person gives you. It is something you choose, one honest step at a time. And sometimes, when the path feels impossible to understand, faith carries you farther than certainty ever could. I believe God was working through moments I could not understand while I was living them. If you are listening right now and carrying an old wound, an unanswered question, or a burden that nobody else seems to understand, I want you to know something. Your story is not over. Other people may hide the truth from you. They may misunderstand you. They may underestimate you. But none of that determines your value. Your value existed before their opinions, and it will remain long after them. Thank you for spending this time with me. Truly. In a world where so many people feel unseen, I hope this story reminded you that you are not alone. Somewhere out there, another person is carrying a similar burden, asking similar questions, hoping for similar answers. Sometimes simply knowing that can make the road feel a little less lonely. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 72 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let hidden truths convince you that you are worth less than you truly are. On the shelf beside my desk today sits a small framed photograph of my mother standing near the water, smiling toward a future she could not see. Every evening when the sun begins to set across the bay, the light catches that frame, and I am reminded that the truth may arrive late, but it still has the power to bring people home. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about life. Sometimes what we think we lost was actually waiting for us all along. If this story meant something to you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who might need this message, consider sharing it with them. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, healing, and the unexpected turns that shape our lives, there are more journeys waiting for you in the playlist. Some begin with heartbreak, some with mystery, and some with a single choice that changes everything. Wherever you decide to go next, I hope you will join me for another story.